Worthless, Aunt Agnes said, snapping the household ledger shut on Clara Winfield's ink-stained fingers just as the Duke stepped into the morning room. The word landed harder than the sharp little sting in her knuckles. Clara did not jerk her hand away. She had learned long ago that sudden movements gave cruel people the pleasure of proof. Instead, she flattened her palm against the mahogany table, lifted her chin, and looked past the silver coffee service, past the vase of pale tulips, past her cousin Louisa's expectant smile, to the man who had just crossed the threshold with rain on his dark riding coat and authority in every line of his body. Julian Ashcroft, Duke of Halden, filled the doorway as if the room had been built to frame him. He was 27, perhaps, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and spare in the way of a man whose strength had been made useful too early. Cold spring light followed him from the hall and struck the hard planes of his face. Warm firelight caught the dark grey of his eyes and turned it almost silver. He removed his gloves one finger at a time, not hurried, not awkward, while Aunt Agnes rose in a flutter of peach silk, and Louisa arranged her mouth into the expression she wore for wealthy men and bishops. "Your Grace," Aunt Agnes said, all honey where she had just been vinegar. "What an unexpected honor. If I had known you were coming, I should have had the blue room opened." "The morning room is sufficient," he said. His voice was low and rough-edged, the kind that seemed to come from deep in the chest and arrive carrying restraint with it. Clara had heard it before, though only at a distance. Once in church, once in a tenant yard when he had settled a quarrel with 6 words and a glance. She had never been this close to it. She had certainly never expected it to be followed by those eyes resting, without apology and without haste, on the hand Aunt Agnes had just trapped beneath the ledger. Theo, Aunt Agnes's youngest son, let out a small breathless sound from the window seat. Thunder had been prowling the sky all morning, and each roll of it tightened the boy's shoulders until they almost touched his ears. Clara turned toward him before she remembered who stood in the room. "Count the windows, Theo," she said softly. "1 by the door, 2 by the hearth, 3 behind your mother's roses. The room cannot close in on you while it still has 3 windows." Theo blinked at her, pressed his palm to the glass, and whispered, 3. Something changed in the Duke's face. It was not dramatic. It was smaller than that, and stranger. A stillness passed through him so complete, it seemed to pull the air taut around the room. His gaze moved from Theo to Clara with a force that made her feel it physically, like the first pressure of a storm before the rain had actually broken. Then his eyes dropped to the table beside her hand. There, half under the ledger Aunt Agnes had shoved aside, sat the little ivory knight Clara used as a paperweight. Its carved horse head had been broken at the neck years ago and badly mended. She had kept it because it was the only thing she owned from before the fire at Longmere House, and because it reminded her that even broken things could still hold a page steady. The Duke crossed the room. Not quickly. That was what made it impossible to ignore. He came forward with the contained certainty of a man who did not hurry because the world generally rearranged itself before he needed it to. Aunt Agnes began speaking again, something about Louisa's music and the parish drive and how happy they all were to be of service if Halden Court required anything at all. But the Duke did not seem to hear a word. He stopped at Clara's chair. "What did you say to the boy?" he asked. Clara curled her fingers once, feeling the tender ridge where the ledger had caught her skin. "That the room has 3 windows. Before that, that he ought to count them if he wished to remember how large the room was." His gaze stayed on her face, not on Louisa's carefully arranged prettiness, not on Aunt Agnes's fluttering hostess smile, not on the silver service or the fire or the rain crawling down the panes. On Clara. Entirely on Clara. "My aunt was describing me to your Grace," Clara said, because silence under that sort of attention could become its own danger. Perhaps she prefers her version. The slightest movement touched the corner of his mouth. It was not amusement. It looked more like recognition, trying not to reveal itself all at once. "I do not want her version," he said. "I want yours." Louisa gave a brittle laugh. "My cousin is useful with lists, Your Grace, if that is what you require. She is not at her best when surprised." "On the contrary," the Duke said, still looking at Clara. "I suspect Miss Winfield is at her best precisely when no one expects her to be." The words struck the room like a dropped glass. Aunt Agnes's fan snapped open. Uncle Peregrine, who had been pretending to study the account book near the hearth while listening to every syllable, straightened so abruptly the poker clanged against the grate. "Your Grace," he said, with a smile that had all the warmth of polished brass. "Clara is a dutiful relation, nothing more." The Duke placed 2 fingers on the broken ivory knight and turned it once against the wood. His expression did not change, but his voice did. It became quieter and therefore more dangerous. "Miss Winfield is not worthless," he said. "She is everything I have been searching for." No one moved. Rain tapped the windows. The fire shifted. Somewhere in the back hall, a footman dropped a spoon and then froze, perhaps in fear of the silence that followed. Clara stared up at the Duke. For one absurd instant, she wondered whether this was some elaborate mockery, a game rich people played when ordinary humiliations had lost their flavor. Yet there was nothing playful in his face. What she saw there was concentration so deep, it made her chest tighten. "You have mistaken me for someone else," she said. "I do not think so. I assure you, Your Grace, there is no line of petitioners waiting to claim relation to your search. Whatever you imagine I am simply my aunt's unpaid bookkeeper." "So I noticed." Uncle Peregrine gave a little cough. "Clara can be sharp when she forgets herself." The Duke finally looked away from her. He looked at Uncle Peregrine instead, and Clara witnessed the extraordinary thing that happened whenever real power turned itself full upon imitation power. Her uncle did not stop smiling. His smile simply ceased to belong to him. "Then perhaps," the Duke said, "she would be better employed where forgetting herself is not treated as a fault." He asked, very calmly, whether Miss Winfield would accompany him to Holden Court for a fortnight to assist with the review of old estate ledgers and insurance schedules connected to Longmere House. Aunt Agnes began agreeing before the sentence had properly ended. Louisa spoke over her, offering her own hand at accounts, her excellent French, her willingness to be of help in any capacity. The Duke refused, without rudeness and without softness. He wanted Clara, only Clara. Clara sat very still while the room bargained with her as though she were a parcel someone had finally offered to collect. "No," she said. 3 people turned toward her, as if the chair had spoken. The Duke's brows lifted. "No." "I do not like being discussed in front of me," Clara said. "And I like being selected even less when I have not been told the purpose of the selection." Louisa's painted mouth parted. Aunt Agnes whispered Clara's name with warning packed into each syllable. But the Duke only watched her another heartbeat, then pulled out the chair opposite, and sat. He sat. Her aunt had not offered him the seat. He took it because he meant to remain long enough to hear an answer that mattered. "Very well," he said. "The purpose is this. 14 years ago, at Longmere House, a fire broke out in the west nursery corridor. A child who should not have survived it was let out by a girl whose face he never properly saw. He remembers 2 things: a broken ivory knight pressed into his palm, and a voice telling him to count the windows." Clara felt the room tilt almost imperceptibly. She saw, all at once and all at once insufficiently, the flash of a passage lit orange through smoke, the heat against her cheek, a smaller hand clutching hers. The impossible steadiness with which her father had always told her to count exits before she counted fears. She saw it, and did not trust it. because memory was treacherous when it arrived on command. "Lots of girls were at Longmere," she said. "Not many carried that piece." He touched the ivory knight again. "I have been looking for its match for years." Her breath went shallow. "You cannot possibly know this one is the same." "Then come to Holden Court and prove me wrong." It was the sort of answer that ought to have annoyed her. Instead, it almost made her smile. Almost. "If I come," she said, "I come as paid staff, not as some curiosity from your childhood. I will not be displayed for gratitude." "Agreed." "I choose my own room." "Agreed." "And if I decide your search has nothing to do with me, I leave the next morning." He held her gaze. "Agreed." Uncle Peregrine cut in too quickly. "There is no need to discuss wages in such crude terms. Clara is family." "Then family," the Duke said without looking at him, "has been getting excellent labor for free." Clara went to Holden Court the next day because wages meant freedom, because Longmere still lived under her skin like a splinter, and because the Duke's certainty had unsettled her more than mockery would have done. The estate itself was all pale stone, spring lawns, and tall library windows. She counted 6 of those windows as the carriage turned in, and disliked herself for doing it. Mrs. Fenn welcomed her as though a missing page had been restored to a favourite book, and Julian, without ceremony, led her straight to the library. There he did what made him difficult to resist from the first. He explained himself plainly. He showed her the other half of the Ivory Knight, set out the trust records, and admitted that memory alone had carried his search, until fresh tenant petitions forced Longmere back into the light. Clara remembered enough to know he was telling the truth. She remembered the jammed latch, the smoke, the stubborn little boy in blue. What she refused to permit was sentimentality. "Do not look at me as though I have stepped out of a prayer," she told him when recognition sharpened his face, "and tell me how to look at you. As a woman with eyes, hands, and a working mind, not as a miracle designed to soothe your childhood." He accepted the rebuke without pride, and answered by laying the ledgers before her. That won him more ground than any romantic speech could have done. Clara found the first irregularities by dusk. Bryce's name appeared in places it should not have appeared. Reimbursement sums had been copied, shifted, and disguised. Julian followed her reasoning without flinching, even when it led straight toward Peregrine Winfield. By the end of the second day, Clara knew 2 things with equal force. The Longmere books had been tampered with, and the Duke of Holden was not admired because he was charming, but because he listened all the way through an answer. The days settled into work. Mornings in the library, afternoons at tenant cottages and old Longmere fields, evenings comparing letters against schedules, while Mrs. Fenn pretended not to notice how often silence between them turned charged. Clara saw how Julian remembered leaking roofs, clever daughters, failing fences, and the names of men who expected no duke to know them. It would have been much easier if he had been arrogant. On the 4th evening, he asked her to accompany him to the May Assembly, because Bryce's widow would attend and might speak more freely in public than in a locked study. "Absolutely not," Clara said. "People will talk whether you come or not," he replied. "I need you there because you see what others miss." "That is still not fair." "No," he said, holding her gaze. "It is honest." She looked away first. "That is not a fair argument." "No," he said. "It is an honest one." The assembly rooms at Norwood glowed with candlelight, gold leaf, silk, and calculation disguised as music. Clara entered on Julian's arm in a deep blue silk gown Mrs. Fenn had somehow conjured into existence. Her hair, usually pinned for usefulness, had been arranged low and soft at the nape. She had protested until she saw herself in the mirror, and discovered protest had become inconvenient. People stared. Of course they stared. She was the Duke's companion for the evening, and not the pretty cousin who had expected the role. Louisa, in shell pink and outrage, stood beside Aunt Agnes near the card-room arch and looked as though she had swallowed a lemon whole. Uncle Peregrine smiled. That was more alarming. "Do not let them make you small," Julian murmured, without moving his lips. "I have never had the luxury of letting them do anything else." He looked down at her. "Then borrow mine for the night." The first dance had not yet begun, and already her pulse was behaving like a poorly trained thing. She saw Bryce's widow within minutes, a thin woman in violet silk with a dyed feather trembling over hair too tightly arranged. Clara steered Julian toward her under cover of greeting Lady Westford. By the time the set began, they had secured a promise of a morning call, and, more importantly, caught the widow's momentary glance toward Uncle Peregrine when the Longmere fire was mentioned. Not fear. Recognition. Useful. Then Julian asked Clara for the first quadrille in a voice pitched for no one but her, and the room, which had been pretending this arrangement might yet resolve itself into something explainable, gave up the pretense entirely. "No," Clara whispered. "Yes. You enjoy being difficult. Only when there is profit in it. And tonight? Tonight there is very great profit." The dance floor opened before them. Clara had not danced since she was 19. She had not danced with a man whose hand at her waist felt like certainty, wrapped in warmth and restraint. Julian moved with controlled grace, every step precise, every turn easy, every public courtesy somehow deepening rather than disguising the current that seemed to pass between them whenever his eyes met hers. He did not grin at her like a foolish boy. He watched her, as though the dance mattered because she was in it. "Your aunt is composing your funeral with her eyebrows," he said, as he guided her through a turn. "I would ask you not to use that word," Clara murmured. "Forgive me." "And Louisa has moved on from funeral to canonization. She appears ready to declare herself a saint, wronged by intimacy itself." The sound Julian made was dangerously close to laughter. "You are very wicked for a woman who claims not to enjoy scandal." "I enjoy accuracy. Scandal simply borrows its coat." The dance ended under applause Clara did not remember earning. Julian bowed. She curtsied. His fingers brushed hers as they rose. A brief contact. Nothing society could object to. The skin at her wrist burned long after the touch had gone. On the terrace, beyond the ballroom doors, air cool with lilac and damp stone met them like mercy. Clara stepped into it too fast, one hand against the balustrade, breathing harder than a single dance warranted. Julian followed, and stopped at a distance that was either generous or cowardly, depending on how she chose to interpret it. "You should not have done that," she said. "Asked you to dance. Used me to make a point." His expression changed. "Is that what you think I was doing?" "I think you are a man who has been searching for an answer for years. I think answers are dangerous things. Men begin to love what they solve, then discover the solution has hands and opinions and inconvenient dignity, and suddenly the admiration feels less simple than they intended." He took one step nearer. "That is what you think I feel for you?" "I think," Clara said, forcing the words steady, "that you still do not fully know whether you are speaking to the girl who led you from smoke, or the woman standing in front of you now." For the first time since she had met him, Julian seemed to lose the exact wording he wanted. "Those are not separate women to me," he said at last. "They are to me." He looked out over the garden, where lanterns shone among the clipped hedges like captured stars. "Then tell me who she is now." Clara folded her arms, because it kept her from reaching for the stone rail, as if balance had become an external object. "She is tired of being measured by what other people require from her. My family requires usefulness. Society requires obedience. You arrived requiring a memory. I am not in the market for new forms of employment masquerading as devotion." Julian's jaw tightened. "You think I brought you here for gratitude? Did you not?" No. Then what did you bring me here for? He turned back to her so fully, she felt the movement like heat. Because every room has been sharper since you entered it. She went very still.
Because you read like a scholar, argue like a barrister, calm frightened children and nervous horses with the same infuriating composure, and make me aware of my own furniture every time you refuse to be impressed by it. Because when you laughed this morning, I wanted to hear it again, and immediately disliked myself for wanting something so quickly. Because I have spent years searching for a girl in smoke, and, quite without my permission, found a woman in daylight. The terrace blurred for one alarming instant. Clara had no defense prepared for honesty spoken that plainly. You should not say such things in gardens, she managed. Why not? Because lilacs are cheats. His mouth moved, not quite a smile, something warmer. Then I shall say them in the library tomorrow, where no flower can take the blame. She did not let him kiss her, not because she did not want him to. That was the trouble. She wanted it enough to distrust the wanting, so she returned inside before the desire in his face could become action, and spent the rest of the evening being admired, pitied, envied, and discussed in every combination available to a room full of bored people with titles. At midnight, while Mrs. Fenn unfastened the blue silk from her shoulders and spoke tactfully of weather, Clara stood in her bedchamber and admitted to herself what she had been refusing since the morning room. Julian Ashcroft did not look at her as though she were a miracle. He looked at her as though she were a problem worthy of reverence. That was much worse. The next morning, Bryce's widow received them in a sitting room that smelled of rosewater and stale dust. Her gloves were too tight at the wrist. Her smile kept collapsing at one corner. I have told His Grace before, she said, once tea had been poured badly and left untouched, that my husband discussed little beyond weather and rents. I cannot imagine why I should be useful now. Because men who leave households after trouble often talk more in private than they intended, Clara said. And because women who survive beside such men generally remember better than they are given credit for. Mrs. Bryce's eyes flicked toward her. Julian, to his credit, said nothing. He let the sentence do its work. Edwin kept a small ledger of his own, Mrs. Bryce said after a pause. Not household books. Personal matters. Names, sums, favors owed. He called it protection. I thought it vulgar. Where is it now? Julian asked. She smoothed her skirt. Mr. Winfield asked for it the week Edwin left service. Clara felt the world narrow to a point. My uncle, she said. He was not your uncle to me then. Only the solicitor, forever prowling about Longmere after the fire, asking who had seen what, which trunks had been opened, whether anyone had touched the trust chest. Edwin said Mr. Winfield liked ashes because they made facts difficult to pick up. Julian's gaze met Clara's over the teacups. She knew then, with the clear, cruel certainty of numbers balancing themselves, that Peregrine had not merely profited from confusion. He had cultivated it. They returned to Halden Court in silence and spent the afternoon in the West Archive Room, a long-neglected chamber off the secondary library, where estate maps and sealed dispatch boxes had been stored because no one alive enjoyed dust enough to volunteer otherwise. The air there carried old linen, dried glue, and the faint mineral scent of damp stone. Clara sneezed twice, cursed once, and found a packet of correspondence hidden behind a rolled tenant survey. Julian leaned beside her shoulder as she loosened the faded ribbon. Letters, 4 from Bryce to Peregrine Winfield, couched in phrases so circumspect they might have passed under a polite nose forever. Shipments secured, balances moved, village complaints containable. One from Peregrine back to Bryce, colder and clearer than the rest. If the compensation schedules are challenged, the disorder of the Longmere event remains our strongest friend. The chest must not be mentioned. Clara sat back on her heels. He knew, she said.
Yes. All these years? Yes.
She pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth. Not to hide tears. She was too angry to cry. Angry for her father, who had spent the last winter of his strength enduring suspicion he could not scrub off. Angry for herself, who had been raised in the household of the man who had quietly benefited from that suspicion. Angry because Julian had been right to come now, and she hated that he had. "I want to go to Longmere," she said. "Today? Now." The ruins of Longmere House stood 3 miles east of Holden Court, the yonder birch stand, and the meadow studded with yellow cowslips. The front block had been stabilized years earlier. Ivy gripped the stone. Half the west wing remained roofless, its upper windows open to the sky like blank, astonished eyes. When Clara stepped from the carriage, wind moved through the empty arches and brought with it the smell of wet earth, old masonry, and something fainter beneath it, the bitter ghost of char caught too deep in timber ever to be fully banished. Her stomach turned. Julian said nothing. He only came around the carriage and stood within reach. "I am not fragile," she said. "No," he said. "You are pale." That irritated her enough to be useful. They entered through the side passage because the main staircase had been stripped out years ago. Mrs. Fenn had sent a groom with lanterns, but daylight still reached most of the lower halls through broken sections of roof. Clara walked slowly, fingers gliding over stone she had not touched since childhood. Here the nursery corridor had run, there the schoolroom door, there the little alcove where she had hidden contraband apples and once a French primer, because Aunt Agnes had already begun insisting too much education made girls hard to place. At the far end of the corridor, she stopped so abruptly Julian nearly walked into her. 3 windows, not intact. One broken out entirely, one boarded, one still carrying its lead panes in a warped black lattice. But 3. The world reeled and righted itself around that number. She saw it. Orange light under a nursery door, smoke under the lintel, her own hands on a brass latch too hot to hold. A little boy in blue, terror so large it had stolen even sound from him. Her father shouting for the east stair, Clara shoving the ivory knight into the child's hand and saying, "Count the windows. 1, 2, 3. If there are still 3, we are not lost." Her knees weakened. Julian caught her. He caught her without fuss, both hands firm around her upper arms, then one hand at her back as he guided her to the stone bench built into the wall. The contact was strong, clean, utterly male, and so careful it undid her faster than panic might have. "Do not apologize," he said, before she had even drawn breath to do it. "I was not going to." Liar. She laughed once, raggedly, and covered her face with her hands. When she lowered them, Julian was crouched in front of her, broad shoulders braced, forearms resting lightly on his thighs, his whole attention fixed on her, as if nothing in the ruined house mattered more than what she said next. "My father was there," she whispered. "Not in the corridor, beyond it. He had gone back for the trust chest because Mr. Bryce told him the reimbursement schedules were in it, and the tenants would be ruined if they burned. I remember him shouting for me to leave. I remember Uncle Peregrine in the outer hall. I thought at the time he had come to help. He was arguing with Bryce." "About what?" She closed her eyes. "About the chest." Her fingers tightened in her lap. "Peregrine said if the books were found, it would all unravel. Bryce said the smoke was spreading too quickly. My father saw them. I think he saw enough." Julian did not touch her face. He only stayed where he was, steady as the bench under her. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her name, as if it belonged between them, rather than in a room full of witnesses. Your father did not deserve what followed. The simple correctness of the sentence broke something. Not her control, she kept that. but the rigid, lonely shape she had made around an old grief loosened just enough for pain to move through it without shredding her.
He spent months writing letters no one answered, she said. He kept insisting the figures would save him if only someone looked long enough. Aunt Agnes called it stubbornness. Peregrine called it delusion. By the end, he hardly spoke above a whisper, as though the world had trained volume out of him. Julian's hand came to rest on the bench beside hers, not covering it, not claiming it, simply there. "Then we will answer him now," he said. She turned her hand. Their fingers met. The contact was small. It felt enormous. On the drive back to Halden Court, Clara did not remove her hand from Julian's until the house came into view. Peregrine struck first. Not with shouting, he was too clever for that. Clever cruelty preferred paper. A note arrived the next morning in Aunt Agnes's crabbed hand, informing Clara that Theo had developed a cough in the storm. Louisa was in tears over local gossip, and it would be an act of decency for Clara to remember she owed everything to the household that had taken her in. Folded inside it, on a separate scrap in Peregrine's legal hand, was a single line. "Return the Longmere papers, and no one need discuss your father's little irregularities in public." Julian found Clara in the library with the note already creased twice in her fist. "What has happened?" She handed it over. He read both lines once, then again more slowly. The muscles in his jaw shifted. "I am going to enjoy ruining him." The words ought to have shocked her. Instead, they warmed something fierce and female in the center of her chest. "No," she said. "I am." His eyes lifted to hers, and there it was again. That charged stillness, that dangerous attention. "What do you intend?" "My aunt's schoolroom at Winfield Lodge still has the old window seat where she hid everything worth having from servants and children. When my father was desperate, he hid things in plain sight, and important things where Aunt Agnes believed only she could control them. If Peregrine took Bryce's personal ledger years ago, he did not keep it in his office. He kept it where his wife would guard it out of vanity." "You want to search the house?" "Yes." "Then you will not do it alone. If you come, they will bar every drawer before we reach the hall." "If I let you go without protection, Mrs. Fenn will put arsenic in my marmalade." Clara stared. Julian's expression remained grave for perhaps 2 whole seconds. Then she saw the glint in his eyes, and knew he had done the impossible. He had made a joke while angry. "Your Grace," she said, "are you attempting levity?" "Very badly." "Continue. I should like to witness the phenomenon." His mouth twitched. "Take Weston with you. He can wait with the carriage. If anything at all feels wrong, you leave immediately." "Yes, Your Grace." "Do not sound so obedient. It makes me suspicious." She returned to Winfield Lodge in a plain dove-grey walking dress and the face she wore when numbers displeased her. It was not a face servants interrupted. Aunt Agnes met her in the front hall with theatrical distress. Louisa took to the pianoforte and pressed her fingers into the keys without producing music. Theo, perfectly well except for the solemn delight of being told to remain indoors, flung himself at Clara's waist and nearly ruined the composure of the entire house. "I came for my blue writing case," Clara said. "Mrs. Fenn says Halden Court's stationery lacks discipline." That was absurd enough to sound true. Aunt Agnes narrowed her eyes, decided it insulted someone else more than her, and waved Clara upstairs. The schoolroom had not changed. Same faded runner, same north light, same window seat with its floral cushion gone flat from years of use. Clara knelt, slid her hand under the carved lip, and found the catch exactly where memory insisted it would be. The board lifted. Beneath it lay old copybooks, a packet of ribbons, 2 pawn tickets, and a thin red leather book tied with black cord. Bryce's ledger. Her heart kicked once. "You always were where you had no business being," said Peregrine from the doorway. Clara did not startle. She tied the ledger into her reticule before she rose. Her uncle stood framed in the schoolroom light, elegant in dark green superfine, handsome in the cold, polished way of men who mistake symmetry for virtue. He had Julian's height, without Julian's substance. His smile arrived early, and meant nothing good.
"There is a carriage in the lane," he said. "Holden's man, I imagine. Very protective of him, our Duke. He has better instincts than most, and yet poor judgment where women are concerned."
Peregrine stepped into the room and closed the door with a soft click. "Give me the book, Clara. This charade has run long enough." "If by charade you mean my family's habit of calling theft stewardship, then yes, I agree." His smile flattened. "Do not become dramatic. Your father made errors. I managed consequences." "You manufactured them." "Be careful." "Or what? You will call me worthless again? You have already spent years trying to make the word fit. It still hangs on you better than on me." Colour touched his cheekbones. For a moment, Clara saw the younger man he had once been. Hungry, elegant, furious that the world did not yield him enough without cleverness. Then the expression was gone, and only calculation remained.
"Holden cannot marry scandal," he said. "If he thinks he can raise you out of pity and nostalgia, he is more foolish than I took him for."
"He is not trying to raise me."
"No?" Peregrine's eyes flicked to her reticule. "Then why does that disappoint you?"
He moved fast. Not fast enough. Clara stepped aside, shoved the schoolroom chair into his path, and was through the door before the chair finished toppling. She gathered her skirts, flew down the back stair, crossed the kitchen passage in a rush of bread scent and startled maids, and reached the yard to find Weston already striding toward her at the sight of her face. "To Holden Court," she said. "Immediately." By the time she burst into the library, Julian was on his feet.
"What happened?" She set Bryce's ledger on the table between them. "Success." His gaze ran over her in one sweeping check for injury before settling on the book.
"And failure?"
"Peregrine knows we have it."
Julian exhaled once through his nose. "Good. Good. I am tired of pretending not to know who my adversary is." They opened Bryce's ledger together. It was worse than Clara had expected, and more precise. Bryce had recorded sums, dates, names, the movement of trust monies into private accounts and back out through shell tenancies created only on paper. He had marked Peregrine's contributions with a tiny inked P and copied the sequence of the Longmere fire in one furious midnight hand. Solicitor arrives after West Wing lamp report. Steward delays bell. Trust chest removed before household count completed. When Clara finished the final page, the room had gone fully dark beyond the windows. Lamps glowed gold across the table. Julian stood with both hands braced on the walnut edge, shoulders set hard enough that the seams of his coat strained. "Tomorrow," he said, "I call the trustees." "No." He looked up sharply. "Tomorrow he expects exactly that," Clara said. "A private accusation, a duel of documents. Men like Peregrine survive those because they know how other men prefer embarrassment handled. Quietly and indoors. Call the trustees, yes, but not to the office. To the public breakfast after the charity recital. Let the widows attend. Let Bryce's wife attend. Let my aunt come in pearl satin and hear every line." Julian's eyes narrowed, not in disagreement, but in admiration dark enough to make her pulse stumble. "You are merciless," he said. "Only with people who taught me the shape of mercy by withholding it." He came around the table. Clara should have stepped back. She did not. He stopped close, one hand lifting, as if he intended to touch her face, then halting an inch away, because for all his contained force, he still asked permission in the final moments, without using a single word. Clara answered by leaning in. The first kiss was not wild. It was worse than wild. It was careful. His mouth met hers with a restraint that knew exactly how strong it was, and did not need to prove it. Warm, firm, patient, in the way fire is patient when it has found dry wood and knows the whole room belongs to it eventually. Clara's fingers caught in the front of his coat. His hand settled at her waist and then tightened just once, as if he felt the same shock she did at how inevitable the kiss seemed in the instant it arrived. When he lifted his head, his forehead rested lightly against hers. "That was not gratitude," he said. Clara's lips tingled. "No." "Good. Do not become arrogant." "I am trying very hard not to."
The public breakfast at Holden Court drew exactly the crowd Clara wanted. Trustees, tenants, clergy, widows in best silk, Lady Westford with a murderous lorgnette, and Aunt Agnes in pearl satin, indeed. Peregrine arrived late with Louisa in pale green, and Theo peering from behind Mrs. Venn's skirts. Clara stood at the far end of the breakfast room, beside the long sideboard, where the trustees had been invited to review old Longmere reimbursements before the recital began. Julian stood near the windows, speaking with the vicar and 2 mill widows. He wore black morning coat and starched linen, and there was something almost cruel in how magnificently male he looked, while so clearly prepared for war. Peregrine saw the ledger on the sideboard. He went still. Then he smiled. "Your Grace," he said easily, coming forward. "I understand there has been some confusion over archival materials. Had Miss Winfield simply written to request old papers, I should have spared everyone this display." "How generous of you," Clara said. Murmurs lifted around the room. Peregrine's gaze flicked to her with polished disdain. "I do not address hired women on legal matters." Julian turned before Clara could reply. Not abruptly, much more cutting than that. "Then you may address the woman I intend to marry," he said, "and choose your next sentence with extraordinary care." Everything that followed that sentence took on the strange, crystalline quality of moments too sharp to be forgotten properly. Aunt Agnes sat down without finding a chair first, and only missed the floor because Lady Westford shoved one under her. Louisa made a noise like a violin string pulled too tight. Theo whispered, "I knew it," to no one in particular. Mrs. Fenn closed her eyes for a heartbeat, in gratitude so complete it looked almost ecclesiastical. Clara herself did not even look at Julian. If she looked at him, she might lose the narrow, bright edge on which the entire morning depended. "How impulsive," Peregrine said after a stunned pause. "You scarcely know what you are saying." "On the contrary," Clara said, and opened Bryce's ledger. She did not rush. She had been rushed over too many meals, too many accounts, too many years. She read the entries in order. March disbursement, mislabeled and diverted. April, adjustment linked to Peregrine's personal note account at Worsley and Finch. The removal of the trust chest during the Longmere fire. The steward's own copied memorandum. She laid beside it the letters from the archive room. Then she asked Mrs. Bryce, who had arrived trembling but resolute in plum silk, whether she recognized her husband's hand. Mrs. Bryce confirmed it in a voice strong enough to carry to the back wall. Peregrine tried interruption. Clara cut through him. He tried condescension. She ignored it. He tried laughing. No one joined. "These are forgeries," he said finally. "Excellent," Clara replied. "Then perhaps you can explain why the private note account listed here matches the mortgage on the meadow parcel you purchased 2 months after the Longmere fire." He said nothing. Clara lifted another paper. "Or why this reimbursement to the East Mill widows appears in your hand in the household copybook at Winfield Lodge, but in Bryce's hand in the official schedule, though the figures differ by £28. Still nothing. The room had gone quiet enough for the candles to be heard. Clara placed her fingertips flat on the ledger, so they would not shake, and turned to the trustees. "My father spent the last season of his life insisting the numbers would save him if anyone bothered to read them. No one did. Not because the figures were unclear,
because the wrong man profited from the fog around them. She looked at Peregrine then, properly, directly, giving him the dignity of being seen as he was. You called me worthless because you knew I had inherited his eye for a page. You preferred me bent over your household accounts, where I could balance your dinners and not your crimes. Peregrine lunged for the ledger. Weston, who had been standing by the door for precisely this reason, intercepted him with one efficient movement. No spectacle, no brawl, just a hand on the arm and a quiet, "Sir." Peregrine stopped, because he had finally reached the point at which physical action would cost him more than it saved. Julian spoke only then. "You will surrender every relevant paper in your possession before sunset," he said. "You will sign a statement for the trustees and the magistrate, and you will not so much as breathe in Miss Winfield's direction again without legal consequence." Peregrine looked at Clara, not Julian. Hatred can make some men ugly. On him, it made beauty meaner and smaller, as if spite reduced the architecture of the face itself. "You think this changes what you are," he said. Clara lifted her chin. "No," she said. "It only changes who gets to define it." He left under Weston's supervision, and the collective stare of a room that had discovered its appetite for truth slightly exceeded its appetite for breakfast. The rest of the day passed in astonishment. Trustees signed statements. The vicar requested copies. Mrs. Bryce wept with relief and rage. Aunt Agnes attempted tears, explanations, and finally offended silence when none of it worked. Louisa looked less angry than bewildered. Only when evening fell and the last carriage rolled away did Clara find herself alone with Julian again. He stood in the library by the western window, coat discarded, waistcoat unbuttoned, one hand braced on the stone mullion as he looked over the darkening garden. Lamps turned the room amber around him. The broken ivory knight, now rejoined on the desk with its twin half placed beside it, gleamed pale in the firelight. Clara closed the door behind her. Julian turned. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara said, "You proposed in a breakfast room full of widows and gossiping matrons. It was not elegant." "No." "It was not private." "No." "It was also, under the circumstances, infuriatingly effective." The relief that crossed his face made her chest ache. "Clara." "I have not answered." "I know." She came farther into the room. Her skirts whispered over the carpet. Outside, one last thread of sunset had snagged itself in the branches of the yews and was dissolving there by degrees. "When you first looked at me in my aunt's morning room," she said, "I thought I was about to become useful in a new and more humiliating fashion. I thought perhaps you wanted to repay a memory. Then at Longmere, I thought perhaps you wanted to save what had once saved you. Today, for approximately 7 minutes, I thought perhaps you were simply mad." That startled the laugh out of him. "Only 7. Do not interrupt. I am being generous." His mouth closed. She stopped in front of him. "I know now that you did search for me. That part was real. But somewhere along the road, whether you intended it or not, you stopped searching for the girl in the smoke and began seeing the woman who argued with you over butter accounts, the one who reorganized your correspondence trays because you sorted by sender instead of by urgency, the one who dislikes being chosen in public and liked being kissed in private rather more than was convenient." His eyes darkened on the last sentence. "A great deal more than was convenient," he said. Clara's pulse leaped, but she held his gaze. "I will not be cherished only when I am brave. I will not be adored as a symbol and managed as a wife. I will not spend the rest of my life earning space in rooms where I already stand." "You will not," he said. "And if I marry you, I keep work." "Please." "My own desk." "Take 2.
authority over the Longmere restitution accounts. Gladly. And Theo may come during storms whenever he pleases, because I refuse to let that child grow up believing fear is shameful. Julian's expression changed at that, went softer and stronger all at once. Anything else? He asked. Clara looked at him. The broad shoulders eased of public tension, the hands that had steadied her in ruins. The man who had searched for a memory and fallen in love with a woman who corrected his filing system and dismantled fraud for breakfast. Yes, she said quietly. One more thing. Name it. When I forget what I am worth, you remind me. Not by declaration, by practice. He stepped close enough for his breath to warm her cheek. Then you do the same for me, he said. Because I have been Duke of Holden for years, and only a tolerable man for a handful of weeks. Clara smiled. That is unreasonably persuasive. I have hidden talents. I noticed. He kissed her again, and this time neither of them pretended patience was anything but a choice being joyfully abandoned. By autumn, the Longmere Restitution Fund had been restored, the first tenant roofs repaired under Clara's supervision, and the little desk, Julian promised her, had expanded into an entire room off the library. Theo considered it his second kingdom. Louisa wrote twice from Bath, once stiffly and once honestly, and Clara answered both letters, because freedom had made generosity possible at last. On the first hard rain of October, when thunder rolled over Holden Court and made the nursery maids exchange weary looks, Clara found Julian in the future schoolroom they had begun planning, standing at the center of the empty floor with a measuring rod in hand and rain at his shoulders from the open terrace door. You are letting the weather in, she said. I am counting windows, he replied. She stopped in the doorway. There were 3, one overlooking the orchard, one facing the south lawn, one turned slightly toward the old road where the world arrived. Julian set down the measuring rod and held out his hand. Come here, Mrs. Ashcroft. She crossed to him, silk whispering against the boards, and placed her palm in his. You are very pleased with yourself, she said. Naturally. I married the woman I spent years looking for. No, Clara said, sliding her arms around his neck. You married the woman who made you stop looking backward. The storm sounded above them, loud and temporary. The room remained large. The windows remained 3. Julian bent his head and kissed her under the unfinished arch of the schoolroom that would one day hold children, ledgers, laughter, and everything her family had once declared beyond her reach. Nothing about the space felt small.